Good afternoon. My name is Deb Arns, and I'm the Senior Museum Curator here at the Nebraska State Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the Society's Museum of Nebraska History and our July 2007 installment of the Brown Bag Lecture Series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the taping of the series for broadcast on Cable Access Channel 5 here in Lincoln. A complete listing of the Brown Bag series and broadcast times can be found on our website, which is www.nebraskahistory.org. Our speaker today is Jim Potter, Senior Research Historian at the Nebraska State Historical Society, and editor, along with Edith Robbins, who I believe is also here today, of the new book, Marching with the 1st Nebraska, A Civil War Diary. Jim will be speaking today about the everyday life of the Nebraska Civil War soldier. So please join me in welcoming Jim Potter.
Thank you very much and welcome. There are some there's some Civil War reenactors who are going to arrive, but like soldiers in all wars, they have apparently become stragglers, but they'll show up eventually. When South Carolina forces attacked Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, bringing on the Civil War, the U.S. regular army consisted of fewer than 16,000 men. To suppress the rebellion, President Abraham Lincoln called up 75,000 state militiamen for 3 months' service under provisions of the Federal Militia Act. He soon realized that this force would not be adequate. Subsequent calls for troops were for 3-year volunteers who would form the bulk of the Union Army that finally emerged from the 4-year conflict victorious in the spring of 1865. Included within the estimated 2.1 million men who fought for the Union were 3,157 officially credited to Nebraska territory, although an undetermined additional number of Nebraskans enlisted in units recruited in other states and territories. While the experiences of Nebraska soldiers were unique, the men also had much in common with their fellow Civil War volunteers, regardless of the theater in which they served or the states or communities from which they came. All Civil War soldiers' daily lives were governed by regulations, chains of command, and logistical concepts that had evolved in the U.S. regular Army and which in turn had been adapted from European military traditions. All Civil War soldiers ate similar food, were issued similar uniforms and equipment, and experienced similar hardships. Like men from both North and South in the war's early days, Nebraska's would-be soldiers did not hesitate to volunteer. Some already belonged to local militia units, although few had much military training because the militia companies were primarily social organizations. Most volunteers enlisted with the expectation that the war would be a short and romantic affair featuring bands, banners, and very little bloodshed. If they were to share in the glory, they had to act promptly. When the federal government authorized Nebraska Territory to raise 1 regiment of volunteer infantry for the Union Army in the spring of 1861, men from counties and towns up and down the Missouri River flocked to the rendezvous at Omaha. Soon, the regiment's complement of 10 companies, comprising 1,000 officers and men, was mustered into U.S. service. My review here today of the life of the Nebraska Civil War soldier will be based on the experiences of the men of the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry, which was converted into a cavalry regiment in the fall of 1863. Some of the men who first enlisted in the spring of 1861 remained in Union service with the regiment for 5 long years. The 1st Nebraska service records, which we do have on microfilm at R Street in the archives, the 1st Nebraska service records list boys as young as 16 or 17, as well as men in their 50s and 60s. Civil War recruits, including those from Nebraska, received only a superficial physical examination. Army regulations provided, quote, "The person of the recruit should be washed clean before he is presented to the surgeon for inspection. It is impossible for the medical officer to ascertain the existence of certain defects that absolutely disqualify, when concealed, as they effectually may be and sometimes are, by incrustations of filth a month old." And here's a form that they used when they did the medical exam. A government report revealed that about 25% of the 1861 enlistees were unfit to be soldiers. It did not take long for the Army to discharge men whose eyesight was found to be so poor they could not distinguish objects at a distance of more than a few feet, those who had hernias, or those with epilepsy or syphilis. The form that the examining surgeon filled out asked if the recruit was, quote, subject to the piles. That recruits lied about their health or that surgeons failed to provide a thorough physical examination is clear from the disability discharge certificate of 1st Nebraska Private Rufus Anderson, which is shown here. Anderson was discharged a few months after his enlistment because he had hemorrhoids that disabled him from marching and rendered him unfit for duty. At the time of his discharge, Anderson admitted that he had suffered from hemorrhoids for 10 years. The hardships of campaigning and life in crowded camps, which often sparked outbreaks of disease, helped weed out the physically weak soldiers or those inclined to shirk their duty. Many of the former died. The shirkers often deserted. Civil War soldiers did not undergo anything resembling today's basic training. Once the volunteers had been formed into companies and then into regiments, their principal training consisted of drilling. That is, mastering a series of evolutions that one historian terms, quote, as intricate as the movements of a ballet. The regiment was the basic tactical unit of the day. Regiments were combined into brigades, brigades into divisions, divisions into corps, and corps into armies. These large bodies of men were expected to be able to move quickly from marching formation into lines of battle, according to signals given by drums and fifes. The maneuvers had to be almost instinctive because soldiers were often required to perform them under fire amid terrifying noise, dense smoke, and ghastly carnage. Proficiency in drill was considered even more important than marksmanship. With enough men shooting at equally large masses of the enemy, they were bound to hit something. And the Army, ever frugal with ammunition, rarely allowed Civil War soldiers to practice with their guns. But the Army required them to drill constantly. This regiment is, I think, a New York regiment, but you can see the muskets with the bayonets that stick up in the air, and they're obviously doing some kind of a regimental formation at this point. The men in volunteer regiments usually elected their company officers, often leading citizens responsible for recruiting the company from a particular county or town. The company officers, in turn, chose the regimental officers, all commissioned by the governor. This system, based upon personal prestige or popularity, meant that most of the officers had no more military experience or aptitude than the men they led. Everyone, officers and men included, had to learn the business of war as they went along. What's more, the enlisted men were often reluctant to take orders or accept discipline from newly commissioned officers who had been their friends, neighbors, or relatives in the communities from which they came. One Brownville, Nebraska soldier wrote to the hometown paper in 1861 noting, quote, military law gives some men the power of temporary tyrants and petty gods, which they are altogether too eager to improve. I have no liking for men who use those laws to make them gods of the hour, to whose imperious sway all things must succumb. Well, those were some of the drawbacks to creating a volunteer army in a democracy where individualism and freedom of speech and action were highly prized. After the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry was ordered from Omaha to Pilot Knob, Missouri in August 1861, Private Thomas Keene of Company H reported that the men first camped in the open, quote, with nothing to shelter us but our blankets and the sky. Because the federal government was at first unprepared to clothe or arm the thousands of new volunteers, the Nebraska soldiers did not receive uniforms and other equipment until several weeks after they had been mustered in. One Nebraskan noted, quote, our clothing was so ragged that it would hardly hold together. Finally, nearly 3 months after the first men had enlisted, the regiment was issued tents and uniforms. The uniform was a standard Union Army outfit consisting of light blue wool trousers, a dark blue wool 9-button frock coat, and a plumed Hardee hat, along with flannel shirts, flannel drawers, socks, and low-cut shoes called Jefferson bootees. A caped overcoat, a blanket, and a 4-button fatigue blouse or sack coat also of wool, were also issued. This photograph is of a 1st Nebraska soldier, Private James Hutton, at about the time the regiment was receiving their uniforms and equipment. Each soldier received a canvas haversack and knapsack, both painted black to make them somewhat waterproof, pouches for rifle cartridges and percussion caps, and a metal cloth-covered canteen. The haversack was used to carry several days' rations, and the knapsack, which was often discarded because of the weight, was supposed to hold extra clothing and other personal effects. Each item had a value fixed by the government, and the soldier's yearly clothing allowance was set at $42. If he drew clothing or equipment exceeding this value because of wear, theft, or loss, the excess came out of his pay of $13 a month for a private. The clothing varied widely in quality and fit. Early in the war, some unscrupulous civilian contractors furnished the government with uniforms made of pressed and glued together scraps of shredded wool, which was called shoddy. These uniforms soon fell apart, particularly when they got wet. And there are stories of soldiers marching in the rain, and as they marched, their uniforms literally fell away from their bodies. This material, shoddy, contributed a word to our vocabulary that now characterizes any cheaply made or substandard product. Other contractors labeled garments in sizes larger than they actually were in order to use less material than they were getting paid for. Shoes were often cheaply made and soon wore out when soldiers routinely marched 15 or 20 miles a day. One historian had estimated the average life of a pair of contractor shoes as 20 to 30 days, and this was probably when marching on softer terrain. 1st Nebraska soldier August Chernow reported that when the regiment was marching through the Rocky Ozarks in Missouri in the winter of 1861-62-63, the troops ended up going barefoot in the snow when their shoes fell apart. The expedition's commander condemned the contractors for furnishing shoes with paper soles, but I found out that sometimes the contractors actually did use pressed paper to make the soles of these shoes. A single-shot, muzzle-loading smoothbore or rifled musket and bayonet completed the infantry soldier's equipment. Due to an early shortage of weapons caused by the rapid expansion of the Union Army, the men of the 1st Nebraska initially were issued guns imported from Europe. By 1862, many had received U.S.-made rifle muskets designed to shoot a conical bullet called a mini ball, after its inventor, a French officer named Minier. Several steps were required to load the powder and bullet through the muzzle, and even a well-trained soldier could fire only 2 or 3 shots per minute. As noted above, the notion of well-trained when it came to marksmanship was almost ridiculous when speaking of the Civil War soldier. Altogether, the soldier's equipment, gun, and 40 rounds of ammunition weighed about 50 pounds. It did not take long for most soldiers to pare down what they carried to the bare minimum. They often rolled extra clothing into their blankets, which they slung over their shoulders and threw away the cumbersome knapsacks. Being in the Civil War Union Army was almost like being on a camping trip that lasted for weeks or months, except on those occasions when a regiment stayed in one place long enough to build log or frame huts. This was most often in the winter when campaigning ceased. The men lived in tents. The 1st Nebraska Regiment was issued wall tents for the officers and Sibley tents for the enlisted men. This image shows Sibley tents that have actually been modified slightly by the soldiers by putting these short log walls under them to give more space inside. A Sibley tent could hold 12 to 15 men and had a small sheet iron stove in the center. Although the men carried their weapons and personal belongings while on the march, an infantry regiment also needed at least 10 wagons, one for each company, to haul tents, rations, and extra ammunition. The 10 wagons required 60 mules. Additional wagons would have been required for the officers' gear and the headquarters supplies. During a winter campaign in 1862, Private Chernow wrote that the wagon train for the division of which the 1st Nebraska was part, this division would consisted of about 4,000 men, took 100 wagons and 600 mules. Other animals in camp included the officers' horses. It is no wonder that Chernow wrote almost daily in his diary about large numbers of soldiers being sent out to scour the countryside simply to provide forage for the draft animals. They got this feed from area farms if they were away from supply bases. If the owner were loyal, he was given a receipt to claim reimbursement. If he was thought to be a rebel, his crops were simply seized. As with soldiers in most wars, the Civil War soldier's daily life was seldom interrupted by fighting the enemy. Much of his time was spent performing fatigue duty, that is to say, gathering forage, chopping firewood, clearing campsites, moving supplies, also standing guard or drilling. The soldier's life was strictly regulated by a routine that varied little from day to day and camp to camp. According to Chernow, when the 1st Nebraska was in the field during the winter of 1862-63 and not on the march, reveille sounded at daybreak, and the men had 15 minutes to rise and fall into ranks for roll call. The drums then beat breakfast call, followed by sick call, when the ailing men were supposed to report to the surgeons. At 7:30 in the morning, the men received their daily assignments, which would include fatigue duty, foraging, or guard duty. At 8 a.m., the new guards relieved the guard details that had been on duty. Almost every day there was drill, perhaps bayonet practice, skirmish exercises, or even a full-scale maneuver involving several regiments. Often there was a dress parade and inspection in the evening. At sunset, after the evening meal, the drums and fifes signaled retreat and the final roll call. Tattoo was played at 9 p.m., and that called the men to their tents, followed by taps at 9:30. A soldier might not be on duty every day, but he also had to find time to wash clothing, clean his weapons, or write letters home. Time simply to relax was exceedingly rare when soldiers were in the field. What sustained the soldiers under such harsh conditions? The basic daily Army ration was 3/4 of a pound of pork, which could either be cured ham or bacon, or 1 1/4 pounds of salted or fresh beef, a pound of hard bread called hardtack, roughly 1/3 of a pound of dried peas or beans, and 1/4 pound of rice or hominy, plus coffee, sugar, a little vinegar, salt and pepper, and sometimes molasses. Strong boiled coffee was perhaps the one part of the ration that the soldiers appreciated the most. The ration provided about 2,300 calories per day, but it lacked vitamins. It was also monotonous and varied in quality. Not much could be done to increase its palatability. Some men detested the salted meat, which came packed in large brine-filled barrels and was sometimes putrid. Others noted that the hardtack was often infested with weevils or worms, fresh meat, according to the wry humor of the day. One soldier wrote of finding 37 worms in one cracker. However, quote, "We eat them without looking." The hardtack was so dry and hard that some soldiers called the crackers Lincoln shingles. In more permanent camps, however, freshly baked bread replaced hardtack, and soldiers sometimes paid local civilians to cook for them. In certain localities and at certain times of the year, fresh fruits and vegetables were available. In late August of 1861 at Pilot Knob, Missouri, 1st Nebraska Private Thomas Keene reported that there was plenty of fresh fruit in the vicinity and we help ourselves. The Army tried to overcome the chronic lack of vitamins in the ration by issuing desiccated vegetables, which had been dried and pressed into blocks for use in soups and stews. Evidently, these were not very palatable, and the story says that they often floated around the kettles, quote, "like dead leaves in a brook," said one writer. Some of the soldiers called them desecrated vegetables. The men themselves took turns cooking for the mess, which was usually an informal group of from 6 to 12 men. Sometimes former slaves who had come into the Union lines, these men and women were called contrabands, took over menial tasks such as cooking and cleaning. When the 1st Nebraska was at Helena, Arkansas in August 1862, the regiment's colonel authorized each company to employ 2 or 3 black men as cooks. African Americans were also employed as wagon drivers. Supplying soldiers with the full ration during field campaigns was often impossible because the company wagons had trouble keeping up with the troops when roads were muddy or non-existent and the terrain was rugged. After soldiers consumed the rations of meat and hardtack that they carried in their haversacks, they were often forced to forage from the countryside. That is to say, taking food from nearby farms or towns. August Chernow reported several instances when he and his comrades killed hogs and other livestock to eat during the 1st Nebraska's winter march in the Missouri Ozarks. Another Nebraska soldier reported that the men were on half rations for as long as a month during this campaign. Another source of food, largely delicacies, was the regimental sutler. He was an independent merchant who operated sort of a traveling PX. Sutlers stocked canned goods, paper and writing instruments, tobacco, razors, candy, and other items not issued by the Army. A sutler's prices were usually very high because of the risk he assumed, and it did not take long for a soldier to squander his $13 a month if he visited the sutler very often. Thomas Keene noted, quote, "We can get anything we want from them for money." And I assume that includes things that weren't authorized, like liquor and other things that the Army frowned on. If the hardships brought on by living out of doors, eating Army rations, and spending most of one's time in heavy labor were not enough, soldiers often suffered with or died from disease. Historians have estimated that 5 Civil War soldiers died of disease for every 2 killed in battle. Out of 359,500 deaths in the Union Army, only about 110,000 came from enemy fire. There were scores of soldiers on the sick list at any given time, which meant that the well men often had to do extra work. Many soldiers, especially those from rural areas, were susceptible to childhood diseases such as measles and mumps, which flared up quickly when thousands of men were forced into crowded camps. At Georgetown, Missouri, in the winter of 1861-62, 1st Nebraska Private Keene reported that an intermittent fever was prevalent in the regiment, and an average of 3 soldiers died weekly. He also wondered if the hospital care was partly to blame. Quote, "Very few men ever come out of our hospitals alive if they are very sick, unless he has an iron constitution." As time went on, crowded and unsanitary living conditions in the military camps promoted the spread of serious and often fatal maladies such as typhoid, dysentery, smallpox, erysipelas, or pneumonia. The medical profession did not yet understand that germs spread by poor sanitation and poor personal hygiene caused these diseases. The drinking water often came from a nearby stream contaminated by human or animal wastes. Nor had medicines been developed in many cases that actually treated or cured illnesses, although one could be vaccinated against smallpox. In many instances, the accepted treatments were addictive or poisonous concoctions such as laudanum, which is an opiate, or calomel, which is mercuric chloride. Many of the treatments kept the soldiers on a debilitating cycle of constipation alternating with diarrhea. In September 1862, when the 1st Nebraska was at Helena, Arkansas, Private Keene reported suffering from a fever for which he took heavy doses of quinine and calomel. Before the fever broke, he got dysentery, which had broken out in the regiment, and he said, quote, "The two together weakened me down considerable." He did survive, however, but at the same time he noted that half the regiment was on the sick list, including Regimental Commander Colonel Robert Livingston. Even the regimental surgeon got sick and died. Accidents, too, took their toll. One of the first men to die in the Nebraska regiment was killed when a gun went off during a false alarm in camp. Other men, often intoxicated, fell to their deaths from the railroad cars or the steamboats that frequently transported the 1st Nebraska when it served in the Missouri-Arkansas region. Although records are somewhat sketchy, disease claimed the lives of at least 139 1st Nebraska soldiers, and another 24 died of accidents or homicides. Only about 19 were killed or mortally wounded in battle with Confederate regulars, guerrillas, or later with Indians. Losses from battle, disease, accidents, desertions, and disability discharges meant most regiments were constantly under strength. Later in the war, a typical regiment probably looked much like this one. This is the 17th Illinois Infantry that served in the West. We have no photograph of the 1st Nebraska in rank order, so I thought this represented probably about what the 1st Nebraska would have looked like in the midpoint of the war. The few hundred, the few hundred men still in the ranks lacked a lot of spit and polish, but they looked ready for about anything. They'd already seen the elephant, as it was called. Recruiting to fill up the depleted regiments went on constantly during the war. August Chernow joined the 1st Nebraska as a recruit in the fall of 1862. Soldiers were supposed to be paid every 2 months, but Army paymasters could not always reach units in the field. Sometimes the men received several months' pay at once, which they tended to squander on alcohol, luxuries from the sutler, or in gambling. Their pay came in greenbacks, paper money so named for the bright green ink that was used in printing on the back of each bill. As inflation eroded the purchasing power, privates' pay was increased from $13 to $16 per month in 1864. Payday sparked one of the soldiers' principal forms of recreation, drinking. The Nebraska Regiment got 4 months' pay just before it marched back to Pilot Knob, Missouri in February of 1863 at the conclusion of the long winter campaign. Thomas Keene, one of the privates assigned to guard duty, was forced to knock down a drunken officer with the butt of his rifle, and he broke the man's jaw. Keene feared the consequences, but the colonel said he had only done his duty. Sometimes the officers arranged for beer and whiskey to be distributed to the men, either as a reward for hard work or to celebrate national holidays or Union victories. On July 4th, 1863, every company of the 1st Nebraska in camp at Pilot Knob received half a keg of beer. The result, wrote August Chernow, was, quote, brutal fights. The men struck each other with their fists until the blood was flowing freely. A few days later, word came that the Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg had surrendered, along with news of the Union victory at Gettysburg. Each company again got half a barrel of beer. Fights broke out again, resulting in, quote, bloody heads among the best of friends, according to Chernow. Gambling also provided recreation, though some soldiers, such as Chernow, resisted the urge and sent home most of their pay. The 1st Nebraska, like many Civil War regiments, had a chaplain who provided some counterweight to the baser instincts of soldier life. Chaplain Thomas W. Tipton, shown here later as after the war as a civilian, not only conducted non-denominational religious services, but he presided over funerals for deceased soldiers and acted as the regimental postmaster to oversee incoming and outgoing mail. Soldiers who wanted to send home some of their pay entrusted it to Tipton, who was granted leave to carry the money back to Nebraska. If comments by Privates Keene and Chernow are any indication, Tipton was well respected in the regiment. Keene called him, quote, a kind, good man, and Chernow said he was unpretentious and, quote, loved by all, even these rough fellows who pay little attention to the laws of God and man. The Nebraska soldiers, like soldiers everywhere, longed for news from home, either in the form of letters or hometown newspapers. These missives arrived much less frequently than the soldiers wished, probably because the correspondents or the Nebraska editors did not always know where the regiment was stationed. Likely some of the newspapers were stolen by other soldiers hungry for reading material. When the 1st Nebraska was at Pilot Knob, the men frequently bought the St. Louis newspapers, often received the same day as they were printed because there was a railroad connecting the Union base at Pilot Knob with St. Louis. Other reading material, such as Bibles and religious tracts, came from groups such as the U.S. Christian Commission. Soldiers often kept diaries and wrote letters to friends and relatives back home. They also wrote letters for publication in the hometown newspapers. Unlike in later U.S. wars, Civil War soldiers' letters were not censored. This lack of censorship, combined with a fairly high level of literacy on the part of the volunteers, explains why so many first-hand accounts of wartime service have survived. In August Chernow's case, he kept a detailed diary so that his friends and relatives back in the German settlement at Grand Island could see the war through his eyes. As a German immigrant, Chernow was prone to describe events and activities in greater detail than his American comrades might have because so many experiences were new to him. Edith Robbins and I have edited that diary, including some of Chernow's letters, and it has recently been published by the University of Oklahoma Press under the title Marching with the 1st Nebraska, a Civil War Diary. Deb mentioned it earlier, and the book is here. And I should note that Edith is in the audience today, so afterwards, if someone would like to have a signed copy, we can arrange that out in the museum store. In the fall of 1863, the lives and routines of the 1st Nebraska soldiers underwent a major change. The regiment was ordered to convert from infantry to cavalry. The former foot soldiers would now become horsemen with different equipment, tactical maneuvers, and camping arrangements. They would have to feed and care for horses as well as for themselves. The bugle would replace the drum and the fife for signaling in camp and on the march. This is an actual flag of the 1st Nebraska Cavalry, probably one they got when they returned to Nebraska in 1864 and served the rest of their enlistment in the Platte Valley against Indians. And it's probably a flag that was made by the citizens of Nebraska. It is in our collections here. Once the newly mounted 1st Nebraska Cavalry received their horses in St. Louis in November and December of 1863, and after a minimum of cavalry training, the regiment was sent to northeastern Arkansas, where it was ordered to pacify a region infested by enemy guerrilla forces. From January through June of 1864, the daily lives of the Nebraska soldiers consisted mostly of riding through rugged terrain at all hours of the day and night, trying to catch an elusive enemy, scouring the countryside to find forage for their horses, and fighting occasional skirmishes. While Chernow liked the excitement that came with being a cavalryman, he also admitted how exhausting it could be, wearing out both the men and their horses. The 1st Nebraska would remain as cavalry for the remainder of its service. After many of the men re-enlisted for another 3 years in the summer of 1864, these veterans were granted a furlough. The regiment, now designated as the 1st Nebraska Veteran Volunteer Cavalry, never returned to the South. When Sioux and Cheyennes began attacking road ranches and stagecoach stations along Nebraska's Platte Valley in August of 1864, the 1st Nebraska was rendezvoused in Omaha and was sent out there to guard the overland trail and the telegraph line until it was finally mustered out of the service in July of 1866. This image was supposedly taken at Fort McPherson, Nebraska, and is probably appears as the cavalrymen. I don't know if this is a 1st Nebraska soldier, but it would be typical of what they look like at this period of their service. During this time, the men lived at small sod or log one-company posts and at larger forts scattered along the Platte, guarding stagecoaches, freight wagons, and the telegraph against Indian raids. In many ways, the men found this period less exciting than their service in the South. They rarely saw an Indian and mostly rode back and forth along the same short stretch of trail, day in and day out, escorting the overland stagecoaches. However, they did receive rations more regularly, often fresh meat from slaughtered beef animals. They were allowed to hunt, and they could buy delicacies such as fresh vegetables and eggs that were supplied by civilian settlements to the east. August Chernow characterized the 1st Nebraska service on the Platte as, quote, "Good times for us soldiers, but life here is very boring." In July 1866, the last of Nebraska's volunteer soldiers were only too glad to be mustered out of the U.S. Army more than a year after the Civil War had officially ended. While I've tried to provide a broad review of the everyday life of Nebraska Civil War soldiers, and they shared many aspects of these with Union soldiers elsewhere, some of the 1st Nebraska men had experiences that were truly unusual and unexpected. August Chernow's Company H was assigned to provo duty in St. Louis during the spring of 1863. Unlike their comrades who rarely saw St. Louis, these men had many opportunities to take in the sights and attractions and experience the hustle and bustle of Missouri's largest city, headquarters for the Union Army's Department of the Missouri, and a major depot for the Trans-Mississippi Theater of the War. As military police, the men of Company H were often exposed to the seamy side of big city life and had the rare experience of being the guards when St. Louis secessionists, many of them prominent citizens, were banished from the city and sent south on steamboats to be released beyond the Confederate lines. Company H was also posted in the fall of 1863 to guard the Navy Yard at the St. Louis suburb of Carondelet. This gave Chernow and his comrades the opportunity to observe the construction of ironclad gunboats for the Union Navy, an experience rare among flatland soldiers. Chernow was, of course, a good rider with excellent powers of observation, and he provided an insightful description of gunboat building that perfectly conveys the significance of these marvels of cutting-edge naval technology. This, in fact, is supposed to be the USS Milwaukee, and it is one of the ironclads that he actually saw being constructed at the time he was sitting on that hill above the Navy Yard. Toward the end of their service, the Nebraska soldiers also campaigned against Indians, an experience not shared by many Civil War volunteers. This reminds us that the war's effects rippled beyond the main theaters in the East and South to reach the states and territories of the American West. While often treated in isolation, the Plains Indian War of 1864-65 is certainly part of the history of the American Civil War. Like soldiers in all wars, the Nebraskans who served during the Civil War were undoubtedly homesick and longed for the war to be over. They left behind wives, children, parents, friends, and often their means of livelihood. Some could not cope with the discipline and hardships of military life and deserted the Army. Others lacked the constitution to endure nearly constant marching, poor food, lack of sanitation, and exposure to the elements. What is most remarkable is the great number of men who, after 3 years of the soldier's life, were willing to re-enlist and who remained in the Army until the Union was restored and even beyond. In this respect, as well as in their general attributes as soldiers, Nebraska's volunteers compare favorably with their Union comrades. Despite the passage of many years and Nebraskans' participation in many subsequent conflicts, both at home and abroad, Nebraska's Civil War soldiers and their sacrifices deserve to be remembered as we approach the 2011 sesquicentennial of the American Civil War. Now, if I could have the lights come up a little bit, I do have a few objects here that I mentioned as part of the soldiers' equipment, and I'll just hold them up, and then after we're all done, if you'd like to come up and take a closer look, you certainly may. I mentioned the haversacks and the knapsacks. This is a haversack that's part of our collection, and I think there were various styles of these, basically a canvas bag. Here's a knapsack, and they were supposed to be sort of stiff and hard so they'd hold their shape, and then on top of it there were these loops, and I suppose ideally you put your blanket or something there, but a lot of the soldiers threw these knapsacks away pretty early because they were just too heavy and cumbersome. I mentioned the famous hardtack, and here we have a framed piece of hardtack which probably is just about as palatable today as it was when it was first issued. This is a Hardy hat, although this is for an artilleryman because the artillery branch was with red piping, red ornamentation. The infantry was blue and the cavalry was yellow. Then we have just one of many examples of the sort of typical Civil War firearms that were used. This is a muzzle-loading musket. This happened to be a smooth bore, which means that they just shot a round ball out of a smooth barrel like a shotgun. Later in the war, they rifled, or they did rifle some of these and issued them with rifling so they would be more accurate. And then as evolution of firearms progressed, all of the main weaponry of the Civil War were what they called rifled muskets. And they were designed to shoot. This is what they called a mini ball. It was named after that French captain that invented it. It's actually a hollow-based lead slug, and the way it worked is it loaded pretty easily into these rifled barrels, but the explosion of the powder would cause this hollow base to expand and then would impart spin to the bullets. So they were much more accurate than just the old smoothbore guns with the round ball. Those are some of my own bullets that I made. I do shoot a Civil War musket occasionally in competition and so forth, so you can certainly pick those up and see how heavy they are. They were deadly at quite a long ways, and they made ghastly wounds, and a lot of times all they could do for a soldier that got hit with one of those mini bullets in the leg or something was just cut his leg off. So after we're done, like I say, come on up if you'd like and take a closer look at some of these objects. Now, before I take questions, I would like to introduce my colleague Edith Robbins, who assisted greatly. In fact, Edith found the diary that's the basis of this book, and she translated it from the German, and then we collaborated together on getting it into publication. Edith is sitting in the back. Edith, stand up, please. Edith lives in Grand Island. We also have some modern-day members of the 1st Nebraska with us, and I'll ask Mark Witkowski to come forward and just introduce the other soldiers and maybe tell us just a little bit about the 1st Nebraska's modern-day activity. see if there are any questions. Just hold that, I think.
Good afternoon. My name is Mark Witkowski, and I am the Regimental Provost Marshal for the 1st Nebraska. We are a group of approximately 40 reenactors, both military and civilian, and approximately once a month, sometimes more, we get together for reenacting actual battles that the 1st Nebraska would have fought in. And we also are there for about 2.5 days, so we set up a camp, an actual Civil War camp, with all the accoutrements. So I just wanted to give a plug here that we will have a reenactment in Blue Springs, Nebraska on the weekend of the 18th and 19th of August. And if you would like, it's a fairly short drive. Come down and you can see what an actual battle looks like, but you can also see what camp life was really like as we portray that as living history. Now, I got to apologize. The Provost Marshal's main job when the troops are on the move is to bring up the rear, to collect deserters and round up stragglers. Since I was here first this morning, I didn't do a very good job of that. Also, the provost in camp's primary job, just like modern law enforcement, was paperwork. So that hasn't changed much. The provost was an independent unit commanded by the Provost Marshal General, who was assigned to each army. The Provost Marshal was responsible for, like I said, keeping the unit together when on the move, but also doing such things as, of course, enforcing the laws in camp, sanitary conditions many times, and also in some situations, in some federal districts, the Provost Marshal was responsible for recruiting and training new recruits. With us today we have Keith Rockefeller, who is our regimental chaplain. He is here in the outfit of early war 1st Nebraska with a 1861 Springfield musket with bayonet attached. And he does have the knapsack and a bedroll. I want to point out to you, if you turn around there, Keith, that over here he carries his canteen, his haversack, which would have contained little items like tins of food. There wasn't hardtack, such like that. The uniforms wasn't real big on pockets. He also has his tin cup. This is his bayonet sheath. Keith has chosen to arm himself with an extra pistol. And over on the right-hand side of his belt, he has a cap box, which is where he would store the percussion caps. And then over here, the larger box is where the paper cartridges are held. And average infantryman was expected to fire at least 3 times a minute. Now in reenactment, we don't use actual mini balls or round balls. We just use blanks. So we've gotten pretty fast at reloading and firing. The average man was issued 40 rounds per day, and in reenactment, we can go through as many as 100 in an hour and a half.
But we don't ram cartridges normally, so they would tear the cartridge, pour the gunpowder, push the bullet in with their fingers, if you fire a muzzleloader, draw the rammer, force the bullet down, withdraw it. It would take 20 seconds to do this. So 3 rounds a minute. And then you put the cap on, take aim, and fire.
We also are with another group also called the Sons of Union Veterans. And we have our past commander here, Paul Hadley, if Paul would stand up there. And the Sons of Union Veterans is the descendants of veterans, and I'm an associate member. I happen to be a descendant of a Confederate veteran, but don't hold that against me.
We try not to. I'm Paul's past commander. I'm also the junior vice commander of the Department of Nebraska, Sons of Union Veterans and Civil War.
And if we have any questions, we'll be available after the lecture outside. Thank you.
I'm sure they'd be glad to have some new recruits for the unit. Anybody would like to wear dark blue wool uniforms in August, just show up at Blue Springs and they'll sign you up. I also couldn't help remarking that it's probably easier to shoot faster when nobody's shooting back, so that's why they use more powder. I do have time, I think, to take a couple or three questions, if there are some, before we conclude. Yes?
Did First Nebraska line up in those lines and march forward in their battles like you see, in the Gettysburg and that sort of thing? Or was it more just finding individuals looking for?
The only two battles that the 1st Nebraska fought in that they would have had a chance to sort of go toe-to-toe with a large mass of Confederates would have been Fort Donelson and Shiloh. And at the former battle, they actually sort of took a position across a roadway that the Confederates were trying to use to break out, and caught them coming up over kind of a hill. And so in that case, they were kind of in solid ranks of firing at the enemy. At Shiloh, according to the reports, the 1st Nebraska did form part of the attack against the Confederate Army on the second day, but several of the accounts talk about how they advanced based on the terrain, and when they'd see the flashes of the enemy's guns, they dropped to the ground. So these were Western men, and they already kind of had a feel for how to use the ground, and so as a result, they suffered relatively few casualties in these two battles. The rest of their combat experience was these little lightning skirmishes where they'd shoot at some guys running through the bushes, or somebody'd shoot at them, and so they never did fight again in what you'd call a major pitched battle.
I wanted to know, when you talked about Pilot Knob, is there anything in there about Pea Ridge?
The 1st Nebraska did not serve at Pea Ridge, or was never at Pea Ridge as far as I know. They didn't participate in the battle at Pea Ridge. So that's kind of, as most of you know, that's just over the border into Arkansas and on the kind of the west end of Arkansas. And it was a major, probably one of the most important battles in the Western theater, but 1st Nebraska wasn't involved in it, although there could have been a scattered soldier from Nebraska somehow there.
Where did Edith find the diary, and why was it in German?
This August Chernow was a German immigrant who came to the Grand Island settlement in 1858, I believe. He was the nephew of one of the original founders of the Grand Island German colony. So the young man came over, and when the governor of Nebraska called for some recruits to fill up the 1st Nebraska, the governor assigned a quota to every county in the territory based on the 1860 census, and Hall County was assigned a quota of 2 men. Chernow had some patriotic feelings. Germans in general, I think, tended to support the Union, so he decided to go in, and he was the only man, as far as we know, from Hall County. But he kept this really extensive diary so that his German friends and relatives back home could experience the war. Some of them hadn't been in this country very long either. After the war, Chernow left Nebraska and he settled in Oregon, and he spent most of the rest of his life in Oregon. Edith was searching for, she knew that he'd moved to Oregon, and she'd also known that I think another of the Grand Island settlers had gone out there to visit him. So I think just taking a chance, she contacted the Oregon Historical Society and asked about this other man, and they said, well, we don't have his stuff, but we have August Chernow's Civil War diary. And it was in German, so fortunately Edith found it because she can translate it. I would have been lost without it. But we worked together because I know the Civil War, and she's able to translate 1860s German, so it became a lot of fun and about a 5-year job. But as I say, the book has been out since April, and it's available if anyone's interested out in the museum store. And if you'd like a signed copy, Edith and I could do that for you too. So with that, again, thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate you coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.